When I woke up from what was supposed to be routine gallbladder surgery, the last thing I expected to find was my daughter hunched over her laptop in the hospital waiting room, frantically typing funeral arrangements. Not get well cards, not recovery plans. My funeral. Complete with venue bookings, catering estimates, and a detailed guest list that included people I hadn't spoken to in years. She thought I was going to die, and instead of praying for my recovery, she was planning my memorial service like it was her wedding day. But here's the thing about underestimating your mother. We don't just get mad, we get strategic. So while she spent the next 6 months planning her dream wedding, convinced she'd soon inherit everything I'd worked for, I spent that time planning something special for her too, her divorce. And let me tell you, the look on her face when she realized what I'd orchestrated during her own reception was absolutely priceless. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Lydia Parker, and for the past 37 years, I've lived a life that most people would call ordinary. Nothing flashy, nothing dramatic, just steady, honest work, and the kind of contentment that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what matters to you. My late husband Walter and I built our life from the ground up in the quiet suburb of Maplewood Heights, where the houses have front porches and neighbors still wave when they pass by. Walter passed away 8 years ago from a sudden heart attack, leaving me with our modest 2-story home, a small but reliable pension from his 25 years at Henderson Manufacturing, and our daughter Gwyneth. At 59, I'd learned to find peace in the simple rhythms of daily life. Morning coffee on the back deck overlooking my vegetable garden, afternoon walks through Willowbrook Park, and evenings spent reading mysteries from the local library, or working on the quilts I donated to the community center every Christmas. The house Walter and I shared isn't much to look at from the outside. Beige siding, black shutters, a mailbox that leans slightly to the left no matter how many times. I've tried to straighten it, but inside it's filled with 37 years of memories. The kitchen table where we ate breakfast every morning, the living room where we watched countless movies curled up on our old brown sofa, and the bedroom where I still sleep on my side of the bed, even though there's no one to crowd anymore. Financially, I'm what you'd call comfortable but not wealthy. Walter's pension provides about $2,800 a month, and I have a small savings account with roughly $45,000 that we'd managed to put away over the years. The house is paid off, which Walter insisted on before he retired, and I drive a reliable 2018 Honda Civic that gets me everywhere I need to go. It's not luxury, but it's security, and after growing up in a house where my parents struggled to pay bills, security has always been more valuable to me than glamour. My daily routine rarely varies. I wake up at 7, make a pot of coffee strong enough to strip paint, and spend an hour in my garden tending to the tomatoes, peppers, and herbs. That supply most of my meals. The neighbors often joke that my backyard looks like a small farm, and they're not wrong. There's something deeply satisfying about growing your own food, about knowing exactly where your dinner came from, and that it was nurtured by your own hands. Weekdays, I volunteer at the Clearwater Community Food Bank, helping sort donations and preparing meal packages for families in need. It's work that fills something in me that retirement had left empty. The sense of being useful, of making a difference in small but meaningful ways. The other volunteers have become like family over the years. Eleanor Chen and I have coffee every Tuesday after our shift, and Frank Rodriguez always brings homemade tamales on Fridays that remind me why I love our little corner of the world. Weekends are for household projects, grocery shopping at Miller's Market where I've shopped for 15 years, and the occasional dinner out at Romano's Italian Bistro downtown. It's the kind of restaurant where the servers know your order and ask about your week, where the portions are generous and the prices haven't changed much in a decade. Walter and I used to go there for our anniversary every year, and I still order his favorite chicken parmesan sometimes, just to feel close to him. The one complexity in my otherwise peaceful life has always been my daughter, Gwyneth Hayes. She's 34 now, married to a man named Gabriel Adams who works in commercial real estate. They live about 20 minutes away in the upscale Thornfield Estates development, in a house that's twice the size of mine, with a 3-car garage and a kitchen that looks like something from a home improvement magazine. Gwyneth has always been ambitious in ways that Walter and I never were. Even as a child, she was drawn to things that sparkled: expensive clothes, brand-name toys, the idea that happiness could be purchased if you just had enough money. We tried to teach her the value of simplicity, of finding joy in small moments, but she seemed to view our contentment as a lack of imagination rather than a choice. After college, she worked her way up to a management position at Pinnacle Marketing Solutions, a job that pays well and comes with benefits but has never seemed to satisfy her. Every conversation we have eventually turns to her plans for advancement, her frustration with colleagues who don't share her drive, or her latest scheme to increase her income. She talks about her work like it's a war she's fighting rather than a career she's building. Gabriel seems like a good enough man, polite, hardworking, devoted to Gwyneth in the way that some men are devoted to keeping peace rather than seeking happiness. He's quiet during family dinners, nodding along when Gwyneth talks about their plans to renovate their kitchen or their ideas for a vacation to Europe. I've often wondered if he's content with their life, or if he's simply learned that agreeing is easier than arguing. Their relationship has always puzzled me. There's an efficiency to it that reminds me more of a business partnership than a marriage. They divide household responsibilities, coordinate their schedules, and make decisions based on financial benefit rather than emotional connection. When Gwyneth talks about Gabriel, it's usually in the context of his earning potential or his connections in the real estate world, rather than the way he makes her laugh or the dreams they share. But despite our differences, despite the way Gwyneth sometimes looks at my simple life with barely concealed impatience, I love my daughter. I've always hoped that someday she'd find the same peace that Walter and I discovered in our modest life, the understanding that enough is actually enough. I never imagined that her restlessness would lead her to plan for my death before I was even sick. The disruption to my quiet life began not with dramatic fanfare, but with a dull, persistent ache in my right side that I initially dismissed as nothing more than the inevitable complaints of a 59-year-old body. For weeks, I attributed the discomfort to sleeping wrong, or perhaps overdoing it in the garden. But as September melted into October, the pain grew sharper, more insistent, until even my morning coffee routine became an exercise in gritting my teeth and pretending everything was fine. It was Eleanor from the food bank who finally convinced me to see a doctor. During one of our Tuesday coffee sessions at Brewster's Cafe on Maple Street, I must have winced one too many times while reaching for my cup. Eleanor, who'd been a nurse for 30 years before retiring, fixed me with that no-nonsense stare that had probably terrified countless patients into compliance. "Lydia Parker," she said, setting down her coffee with enough force to make the spoon rattle. "You've been favoring your right side for 2 weeks now. Either you're developing some very strange new walking habits, or something's wrong. What's it going to be?" The next morning, I found myself in Dr. Harrison's office at Clearwater Medical Center, the same family practice where Walter and I had been patients for over 2 decades. Dr. Harrison, a soft-spoken man with graying temples and an unhurried manner, listened to my symptoms with the kind of attention that made me feel both grateful and slightly foolish for waiting so long. After an examination that involved more poking and prodding than I'd experienced in years, followed by an ultrasound that required me to drink what tasted like liquid chalk, Dr. Harrison delivered his verdict with characteristic gentleness. "Mrs. Parker, you have gallstones, several of them, and one is large enough that it's likely causing the pain you've been experiencing." He explained the condition with the patience of someone who'd had this conversation hundreds of times before. The gallbladder, that small organ I'd never given much thought to, was essentially malfunctioning. The stones were blocking the normal flow of bile, causing inflammation and the sharp, persistent pain that had been making my days increasingly uncomfortable. The good news, Dr. Harrison continued, pulling up what looked like an ultrasound image on his computer screen, is that this is completely treatable. Laparoscopic gallbladder removal is one of the most common surgeries we perform. Minimally invasive, relatively quick recovery time. You'll be back to your garden in a few weeks. The word surgery hit me with unexpected force. Walter and I had been fortunate throughout our marriage. Aside from his heart attack, neither of us had faced any serious medical issues. The idea of being put under anesthesia, of having an organ removed from my body, felt simultaneously routine and terrifying. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dr. Harrison must have noticed my expression because his voice became even gentler. I know it sounds intimidating, but I want you to think of this as preventive care. If we don't address this now, you're looking at the possibility of more serious complications down the line. Infected gallbladder, blocked bile ducts. Trust me, you don't want to wait until it becomes an emergency. I left the medical center with a surgery date scheduled for the following Thursday, a packet of pre-operative instructions, and a strange mixture of relief and anxiety churning in my stomach. Finally, having an explanation for the pain was comforting, but the prospect of surgery, even routine surgery, felt like stepping into uncharted territory. That evening, I called Gwyneth to let her know about the diagnosis and the upcoming procedure. I'd debated whether to tell her at all, knowing her tendency to dramatize situations, but she was my only family, and it felt wrong to keep something this significant to myself. Gallbladder surgery? Gwyneth's voice carried that particular tone she got when she was trying to process information that didn't fit her expectations. Mom, that's serious. How long have you been having symptoms? Why didn't you tell me sooner? I explained about the gradual onset of pain, about finally seeing Dr. Harrison, about the routine nature of the procedure. But even as I spoke, I could hear something shifting in Gwyneth's response, a quality I couldn't quite identify at the time. Of course, Gabriel and I will be there, she said quickly. We'll drive you to the hospital, stay during the surgery, help you get settled at home afterward. You shouldn't be dealing with this alone. Her immediate offer of support should have been comforting, and part of me was genuinely touched by her concern. But there was something else in her voice, an underlying current of excitement? That seemed like too strong a word. But there was definitely something more than simple worry about her mother's health. The recovery time, Gwyneth continued. How long did Dr. Harrison say you'd need to take it easy? Will you be able to manage the house, the shopping, all your regular activities? I assured her that the doctor had described it as a relatively quick recovery, a few days of rest, a couple of weeks of limited activity, and then back to normal. But Gwyneth's questions kept coming, each one probing deeper into the specifics of my condition, the potential complications, the what-ifs that I'd been trying not to think about. You know, Mom, she said as our conversation was winding down, this might actually be a blessing in disguise, a chance for you to slow down a little, let other people take care of you for once. Gabriel and I have been talking about how you do too much, how you never ask for help. Maybe this is exactly what you need. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of chamomile tea, watching the last light fade from my backyard garden. Gwyneth's reaction had been perfectly appropriate, concerned, supportive, loving. So why did I have this nagging feeling that something about our conversation had felt off? Why did her eagerness to help seem to carry an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite name? I pushed the feeling aside, attributing it to pre-surgery nerves and the general anxiety that comes with facing any medical procedure. Gwyneth was my daughter, and she was worried about me. What could be more natural than that? But as I prepared for bed that night, I couldn't shake the memory of her voice when she'd talked about this being a blessing in disguise, or the way she'd lingered on questions about my recovery time and ability to manage on my own. It felt less like concern for my well-being and more like inventory. Like she was taking stock of something I couldn't see yet. The surgery was scheduled for a Thursday morning at 7:30, which meant arriving at Clearwater Medical Center before dawn on what turned out to be one of those crisp October days when your breath makes small clouds in the air. Gwyneth and Gabriel picked me up at 5:45, and I was grateful for their company during what felt like the longest car ride of my life, even though the hospital was only 15 minutes away. Gwyneth had been unusually attentive in the days leading up to the surgery. She'd called every evening to check on my preparation, offering to help with everything from grocery shopping to organizing my medications. She'd even insisted on coming over the night before to help me pack my overnight bag, though the nurse had made it clear I'd likely be discharged the same day if everything went smoothly. "You can never be too prepared," Gwyneth had said, carefully folding an extra nightgown into my small duffel bag. "What if there are complications? What if you need to stay longer? It's better to have everything you might need." At the time, I'd appreciated her thoroughness, but something about the way she'd handled my belongings had felt odd. She'd opened every drawer in my bedroom, ostensibly looking for comfortable clothes for my recovery, but her attention seemed to linger on things that had nothing to do with post-surgery comfort. She'd picked up and examined the small jewelry box where I kept my wedding ring and the pearl earrings Walter had given me for our 20th anniversary. She'd asked detailed questions about my important documents, where I kept my insurance papers, my will, my bank statements. "Just in case," she'd explained when I'd raised an eyebrow at her interest in my filing system, "if something happens and you can't communicate, Gabriel and I need to know where to find everything important." The pre-surgery process at the hospital moved with the efficient choreography of a well-rehearsed dance. Check-in, paperwork, changing into a hospital gown that seemed designed to rob patients of any remaining dignity, and then the waiting. Gwyneth and Gabriel sat with me in the preoperative area, making small talk with the nurses and asking questions that seemed to go far beyond normal family concern. "What exactly will the anesthesia involve?" Gwyneth asked Dr. Harrison when he stopped by to review the procedure one final time. "Are there risks of not waking up? I mean, at Mom's age, is general anesthesia completely safe?" Dr. Harrison's response was reassuring and professional, explaining that while all surgery carried some risk, laparoscopic gallbladder removal was extremely routine, especially for someone in my generally good health. But I noticed how intently Gwyneth listened to his explanation of the anesthesia process, taking mental notes in a way that seemed excessive for a routine procedure. The strangest moment came just before they wheeled me into the operating room. As the pre-medication began to make me drowsy, I heard Gwyneth speaking quietly to Gabriel near the foot of my bed. Her voice was low, but not quite low enough. "Make sure you get the name of the funeral home Dr. Harrison mentioned last week," she murmured. "And we should probably start thinking about the service. Something simple, but nice. Mom always said she wanted something small." I tried to focus through the haze of medication, wondering if I'd misheard. What funeral home? Dr. Harrison had never mentioned funeral homes. Our conversations had been entirely focused on the routine nature of the surgery and my quick recovery. And while I had, in passing years ago, mentioned preferring simple services to elaborate ones, it seemed like an odd thing for Gwyneth to be discussing moments before my surgery. But the medication was pulling me under, and I convinced myself I'd misunderstood. Pre-surgery anxiety could make anyone's mind play tricks, and maybe Gwyneth was just being overly cautious, thinking through worst-case scenarios the way some people do when they're worried. The surgery went exactly as Dr. Harrison had predicted. I woke up in recovery feeling groggy but surprisingly comfortable, with only minimal pain at the small incision sites. The nurse, a cheerful woman named Madeline Rivera, explained that everything had gone perfectly and that I'd be able to go home that evening as planned. "Your daughter's been asking for updates every 30 minutes. Madeline said with a smile as she checked my vital signs. "She's been in the waiting room the whole time, very concerned about you." When Gwyneth and Gabriel were finally allowed into the recovery area, Gwyneth's relief seemed genuine and immediate. She hugged me carefully, mindful of the IV and monitoring equipment, and her eyes were actually teary when she pulled back. "I was so worried," she said, gripping my hand. "I know Dr. Harrison said it was routine, but you never know. Anything can happen during surgery." But even as she expressed her relief, I noticed her eyes scanning the monitors, the IV bags, the various medical equipment surrounding my bed. When she thought I wasn't looking, she took photos with her phone. Not casual family photos, but detailed shots of the medical setup, the monitors showing my vital signs, even the paperwork clipped to the foot of my bed. "For Gabriel's insurance records," she explained when she caught me watching, "in case we need documentation of the procedure. For any claims or follow-up care. That explanation made sense, but something about her behavior continued to feel off. During the 2 hours I spent in recovery, Gwyneth asked the nursing staff an unusual number of questions about my condition, my prognosis, and the typical recovery timeline. But her questions weren't focused on helping me heal. They seemed more concerned with understanding exactly how long I'd be dependent on others for care. "So she'll need help with grocery shopping, cooking, that sort of thing?" Gwyneth asked Madeline. "For how long exactly? And what about her volunteer work? When can she return to her normal activities?" "Will she need follow-up appointments?" Gabriel added. "Regular check-ins with Dr. Harrison? Any ongoing medication?" Their concern should have been touching, but there was something clinical about their information gathering that made me uncomfortable. They weren't asking how to help me feel better. They were asking for a timeline, as if they were planning something that required knowing exactly when I'd be back to full independence. The ride home that evening was quiet, with Gabriel driving, carefully to avoid any bumps that might cause me discomfort. Gwyneth sat in the back seat with me, fussing over my seatbelt and asking repeatedly if I was comfortable. But I caught her checking her phone frequently, typing what looked like text messages when she thought I wasn't paying attention. When we arrived at my house, Gwyneth insisted on coming inside to help me get settled, which I appreciated. But once again, her attention seemed divided between caring for me and examining my living space, with an intensity that felt more like evaluation than concern. She spent an unusually long time in my kitchen, opening cabinets and checking the contents of my refrigerator and pantry. She made notes on her phone about items I might need, but also seemed to be taking inventory of my household goods, my small appliances, even the dishes and cookware that had been wedding gifts decades ago. "I'm just making sure you have everything you need for recovery," she explained when I asked about her thoroughness. "Gabriel and I want to make sure you're completely taken care of." But as I settled into my own bed that night, grateful to be home and healing well, I couldn't shake the feeling that Gwyneth's version of taking care of me involved taking stock of far more than my immediate medical needs. Her questions, her photos, her intense interest in timelines and documentation, it all felt like preparation for something much more significant than helping me recover from routine surgery. I told myself I was being paranoid, that pain medication and post-surgical stress were making me imagine problems that didn't exist. But deep down, a small voice was whispering that my daughter's concern for my well-being might not be as straightforward as it appeared. The first week of my recovery passed quietly, with the kind of gentle routine that comes with having nowhere, urgent to be, and nothing pressing to accomplish. Dr. Harrison had been right about the minimally invasive nature of the surgery. By the third day, I was moving around my house with only mild discomfort, and by the end of the week, I was back to making my own meals and handling basic household tasks. What I wasn't prepared for was how thoroughly Gwyneth had inserted herself into my daily life during this recovery period. She called every morning at exactly 8 o'clock to check on my progress, and every evening at 6 to review how my day had gone. While her attentiveness was touching in principle, The nature of her questions began to feel more like surveillance than support. "How are your energy levels today, Mom?" she'd ask during our morning calls. "Are you feeling strong enough to handle your own shopping? Or do you still need help with that? What about driving? Do you feel confident behind the wheel yet?" These weren't unreasonable questions for a daughter to ask her recovering mother. But Gwyneth's follow-up inquiries revealed a level of interest in my capabilities that seemed excessive. She wanted to know exactly how long I could stand without fatigue, whether I'd been able to lift anything heavier than a gallon of milk, if I'd experienced any moments of dizziness or confusion that might indicate complications. More unsettling was her persistent interest in my financial management during recovery. During one of her evening check-ins, she spent nearly 20 minutes asking about my bill-paying routine, whether I'd been able to stay on top of my monthly obligations, and if I needed help organizing my finances while I was not quite back to normal. "I just worry that you might miss something important while you're focused on healing," she explained. "Gabriel handles all our bills online now. It's so much more efficient than writing checks. Maybe we should set up something similar for you, just temporarily, until you're feeling completely like yourself again." I assured her that my finances were perfectly manageable. Paying a few monthly bills hardly required the energy of a marathon runner, but her suggestions became increasingly specific. She offered to help me set up automatic payments, to review my bank statements for any irregularities, even to temporarily add her name to my checking account just in case of emergency. "What if something happened and you couldn't access your accounts?" she pressed during one particularly lengthy conversation. "What if you had another medical issue and Gabriel and I needed to pay your bills or handle your expenses? It would be so much easier if we had some kind of access ahead of time." The practical logic of her arguments was sound, but something about her urgency to gain access to my financial information felt premature. I was recovering from gallbladder surgery, not brain surgery. My cognitive abilities were completely intact, and my physical limitations were minimal and temporary. Why was she so focused on scenarios where I'd be unable to manage my own affairs? My suspicions deepened when Eleanor Chen stopped by during my second week of recovery, bringing a casserole and her usual no-nonsense perspective on life. We were sitting in my kitchen, catching up on food bank gossip and sharing updates on our respective health issues, when Eleanor made an observation that stopped me cold. "Funny thing," she said, stirring sugar into her coffee. "I ran into your Gwyneth at Miller's Market yesterday afternoon. She was in the floral section, talking to Janet Miller about funeral arrangements. Seemed like a pretty detailed conversation for someone whose mother just had routine surgery." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "Funeral arrangements?" Eleanor nodded, her expression thoughtful. I didn't want to interrupt, but I could hear part of their conversation. Gwyneth was asking about flower options, pricing for different types of services, even asking about the timeline for planning memorial services. Janet looked as confused as I felt. I think she assumed there'd been some kind of family emergency I didn't know about. Eleanor's news hit me like a physical blow, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe Gwyneth had been asking questions for a friend, or perhaps she was planning ahead for some distant future scenario. But even as I made excuses, I couldn't shake the image of my daughter discussing my funeral arrangements while I was home recovering from successful surgery. That evening, when Gwyneth called for her usual check-in, I decided to test my growing suspicions with a casual question. "I've been thinking about updating some of my paperwork," I said, keeping my voice light. "You know, making sure my will is current, that sort of thing. Have you given any thought to what you'd want me to include?" The change in Gwyneth's voice was immediate and dramatic. Where moments before she'd been asking routine questions about my energy levels and appetite, suddenly she was fully engaged, asking detailed questions about my assets, my insurance policies, and my intentions for distributing my estate. "Well, obviously the house would come to me," she said with a confidence that took my breath away. "And your savings accounts, investment funds, all of that. I mean, I'm your only child, so it's pretty straightforward. Have you talked to anyone about the tax implications? Sometimes it's better to transfer assets before they become part of an estate settlement. The casual way she discussed inheriting my possessions while I was very much alive and sitting in my own kitchen was chilling. But what came next was even worse. You know, Mom, Gabriel and I have been talking about the future a lot lately, about how we want to expand our family, maybe buy a bigger house in a few years. Your place would actually be perfect for us. The location is great, and the lot size would give us room to add on. We've even driven by some of the other houses in your neighborhood to get a sense of property values. She continued talking about their plans for my home, their ideas for renovations, their timeline for making changes, as if my death and their inheritance were foregone conclusions rather than distant possibilities. The casual nature of her planning was breathtaking in its presumption. Of course, we'd want to honor your memory in the house, she added, as if this somehow softened the impact of her words. Maybe keep your garden or set up a little memorial space where you like to sit on the back deck. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at the cup of tea that had grown cold in my hands. My daughter, the child I'd raised and loved and supported through every challenge of her life, was apparently so certain of my imminent death that she was already making detailed plans for my funeral, discussing my inheritance as if it were a done deal and touring my neighborhood to assess the property values of her soon-to-be inherited home. The most disturbing part wasn't just that she was planning for my death, it was that she seemed to be planning for it to happen soon. Her questions about my recovery timeline, her urgency to gain access to my finances, her detailed conversations about funeral arrangements just days after successful surgery. It all pointed to expectations that went far beyond normal concern for an aging parent's future. I began to wonder if Gwyneth's assessment of my surgery had been very different from Dr. Harrison's optimistic prognosis. Had she interpreted routine procedure as dangerous operation? Had she convinced herself that my chances of survival were much lower than they actually were? Or was there something else driving her apparent certainty that my time was running out? Either way, the pattern was clear. My daughter wasn't just planning for the possibility of my death. She was actively preparing for it, with a level of detail and urgency that suggested she believed it was imminent. And that realization filled me with a cold dread that had nothing to do with my surgical recovery and everything to do with the growing certainty that I didn't really know my daughter at all. By the third week of my recovery, what had started, as Gwyneth's helpful concern had evolved into something that felt more like a carefully orchestrated campaign. Her daily check-ins became longer and more intrusive, her suggestions more insistent, and her presence in my life more suffocating than supportive. It was as if my successful surgery had disappointed her in some fundamental way, and now she was working overtime to compensate for outcomes that hadn't aligned with her expectations. The shift became unmistakable when she showed up at my house on a Tuesday morning, unannounced, carrying a stack of papers and wearing the kind of determined expression that I recognized from her childhood. The look she got when she'd decided something needed to happen and wasn't prepared to take no for an answer. "Mom, we need to talk about practical matters," she announced, settling herself at my kitchen table without waiting for an invitation. "Gabriel and I have been doing research, and there are some things you need to address while you're still recovering. Time-sensitive things that could really affect your future security." She spread the papers across my table with the efficiency of someone conducting a business meeting. At first glance, they looked like official documents, forms from insurance, companies, bank applications, legal paperwork with dense text and signature lines highlighted in yellow. "This is a healthcare proxy form," she explained, pointing to the first document. "It gives Gabriel and me the authority to make medical decisions for you if you're ever unable to make them yourself. After what happened with your surgery, what could have happened? We realized how unprepared we all were." I stared at the form, feeling a familiar chill of unease. "Gwyneth, the surgery went perfectly. I was conscious and making my own decisions within hours of the procedure. Why would I need someone else to make medical decisions for me? Her response came quickly, as if she'd anticipated this question. Mom, you're almost 60 years old. Things can change so fast at your age. What if you have a stroke? What if you develop dementia? What if there's another surgery and complications this time? Gabriel and I just want to make sure we can take care of you properly. The way she said, "take care of you," carried implications that made my skin crawl. This wasn't about ensuring my well-being. This was about ensuring control. The next document was even more troubling. This is a financial power of attorney, Gwyneth continued, her voice taking on the patient tone people use when explaining something to a child. It would let Gabriel and me manage your finances if you become unable to handle them yourself. We could pay your bills, manage your investments, make sure your money is being used wisely. I picked up the document, scanning the legal language that would essentially give my daughter and her husband complete control over every asset I'd spent decades accumulating. Gwyneth, I pay 3 bills a month and have a savings account at First National Bank. What exactly do you think needs managing? Her laugh was light, but there was an edge to it that hadn't been there before. Mom, you're being naive. Financial management is complicated these days. Identity theft, online scams, predatory lending. Older people are targeted constantly. Gabriel works in real estate. He understands investments and market trends. We could probably grow your savings significantly if you'd let us help. The third document was the most brazen of all. A quitclaim deed that would transfer ownership of my house to Gwyneth and Gabriel while allowing me to continue living in it as a life tenant. The language was complex, but the intent was clear. They would own my home while I was still alive to see it happen. This is actually a really smart tax strategy, Gwyneth explained, her voice bright with false enthusiasm. If you transfer the house to us now, it avoids probate complications later. Plus, we'd be responsible for maintenance, property taxes, all those expenses that are only going to get more difficult for you to handle as you get older. I set the document down carefully, trying to process the audacity of what my daughter was proposing. So you want me to sign over my house, my finances, and my medical decision-making authority to you and Gabriel? While I'm perfectly healthy and completely capable of managing my own affairs? Gwyneth's expression shifted, and for a moment, I saw something cold and calculating behind her concerned daughter facade. Mom, I know this seems overwhelming, but Gabriel and I have talked to lawyers, financial advisors, estate planners. This is what responsible families do. This is how you protect assets and ensure proper care. She leaned forward, her voice becoming more urgent. And honestly, we need to move quickly on some of this. Gabriel's been looking at investment opportunities. That could really benefit your portfolio, but they require quick action. And the housing market is perfect right now for transferring property. The tax advantages won't last forever. The pressure in her voice was unmistakable now. This wasn't a suggestion or a helpful offer. This was a demand disguised as concern, with artificial urgency designed to prevent me from thinking too carefully about what I was being asked to sign. What if I want to think about this? I asked. Maybe consult with my own lawyer, or talk to Dr. Harrison about whether I really need a healthcare proxy. Gwyneth's mask slipped another degree. Mom, overthinking this is exactly the kind of mistake that costs families thousands of dollars and creates legal nightmares. We're trying to help you, but we can't protect you if you won't let us. Gabriel, who had been silent during most of this conversation, finally spoke up. Mrs. Parker, I know this feels like a lot, but Gwyneth's right about the timing. I've got some opportunities in commercial real estate that could double your savings in the next year, but they require moving quickly. And with the new tax laws coming into effect, transferring property now could save you significant money down the line. His tone was smooth, professional, but there was something rehearsed about his explanation that made me suspect this entire presentation had been carefully planned and practiced. "You both seem to have put a lot of thought into this," I said slowly. "How long have you been researching these options?" Another telling pause. Gwyneth and Gabriel exchanged a quick glance before she answered. "We started looking into it after your surgery, when we saw how quickly things could change, how important it is to be prepared." But Eleanor's observation about Gwyneth discussing funeral arrangements at Miller's Market had been during my first week of recovery, which meant the planning had started much earlier than they were admitting, possibly even before my surgery had taken place. "I need time to think about this," I said firmly, gathering the papers into a neat stack. "These are big decisions, and I want to make sure I understand all the implications." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Gwyneth's concerned daughter expression evaporated completely, replaced by something much less pleasant. "Mom, Gabriel and I are trying to help you, but we can't force you to make smart decisions. If you want to risk losing everything you've worked for because you're too stubborn to accept help, that's your choice. But don't come crying to us when you're taken advantage of by strangers who don't care about your well-being." The manipulation was so blatant it took my breath away. Within the span of an hour, I'd gone from being a healthy, competent woman recovering well from routine surgery to being portrayed as a vulnerable, confused elderly person in desperate need of protection from my own poor judgment. As they gathered their papers and prepared to leave, Gwyneth delivered what felt like an ultimatum disguised as loving concern. "Gabriel and I are planning our future around taking care of you, Mom, but we can't do that if you won't meet us halfway. We need to know that you trust us enough to let us help. Otherwise, we'll have to make different plans for our lives." After they left, I sat in my kitchen surrounded by the comfortable familiarity of my own home, the home they wanted me to sign over to them, and tried to process what had just happened. My daughter and her husband had essentially presented me with a comprehensive plan to transfer all my assets and decision-making authority to them, with a timeline that suggested urgency and consequences that sounded suspiciously like threats. The most chilling part was the realization that this wasn't a spontaneous offer born from post-surgery concern. This was a carefully researched, professionally planned strategy that had been in development for weeks, possibly longer. My successful recovery hadn't prompted their interest in my affairs. It had simply accelerated their timeline for gaining control of them. The documents Gwyneth had left behind sat on my kitchen table for 3 days, their yellow highlighted signature lines seeming to glow with accusation every time I walked past. I found myself avoiding the kitchen entirely, taking my morning coffee on the back deck and eating simple meals that didn't require much preparation. The papers felt like they were radiating some kind of toxic energy that made my own home feel unsafe. By Friday evening, I couldn't stand the weight of uncertainty any longer. I called the one person I trusted to give me honest advice without judgment or agenda, my old friend, Eleanor Chen. When I explained the situation over the phone, her silence stretched so long I wondered if the call had dropped. "Eleanor? Are you still there?" "Oh, I'm here," she said finally, her voice carrying a tone I'd never heard from her before. "Lydia, honey, I think you need to come over here right now and bring those papers with you." Eleanor lived in a small cottage on the other side of Willowbrook Park, a 10-minute drive that felt like an hour as I wrestled with conflicting emotions. Part of me felt guilty for seeking outside perspective on what should have been a private family matter. Another part of me was desperate for someone to tell me I was overreacting, that Gwyneth's proposals were normal expressions of filial concern that I was misinterpreting through post-surgical paranoia. But the largest part of me, the part that had been growing stronger since my surgery, knew that something was fundamentally wrong with what my daughter was asking me to do. Eleanor's cottage was warm and welcoming as always, filled with the scent of cinnamon tea and the comfortable clutter of a life well lived. She settled me on her living room sofa with a steaming mug and asked me to start from the beginning, to tell her everything that had happened since my surgery, without leaving out any details that might seem insignificant. As I recounted Gwyneth's behavior over the past 3 weeks, the intrusive questions, the financial inquiries, the conversation about funeral arrangements at Miller's Market, and finally the presentation of legal documents. I watched Eleanor's expression grow increasingly grave. "Let me see those papers," she said when I finished my account. Eleanor had spent 30 years as a nurse, but before that, she'd worked for 10 years as a paralegal at a law firm specializing in elder care. She put on her reading glasses and examined each document with the kind of careful attention that made me realize how hastily I'd reviewed them myself. "Lydia," she said after several minutes of silent reading, "these documents would give Gwyneth and Gabriel complete control over every aspect of your life. The healthcare proxy is broad enough that they could make decisions about your living situation, your medical treatment, even your end-of-life care. The financial power of attorney would let them access every account you have, sell your investments, even take out loans against your assets." She held up the quitclaim deed with particular alarm. "And this would make you a tenant in your own home. Technically, they could evict you if they decided you were no longer capable of independent living. You'd have all the responsibilities of home ownership, maintenance, taxes, upkeep, but none of the rights." Eleanor set the papers aside and fixed me with the kind of direct stare that had probably convinced countless patients to take their medicine. "Honey, I've seen this before. Not often, but I've seen it. Adult children who convince themselves their parents are more fragile than they actually are, who use medical episodes as opportunities to gain control over their parents' lives and assets." The clinical way she described the situation somehow made it both more real and more frightening. "But surely Gwyneth wouldn't. I mean, she's my daughter. She loves me." Eleanor's expression softened. "I'm sure she does love you in her way. But love and greed can coexist in the same heart, especially when people convince themselves they're acting in someone else's best interest. The question you need to ask yourself is, if you were completely healthy and showing no signs of cognitive decline, would a loving daughter be pressuring you to sign over your independence?" I thought about the urgency in Gwyneth's voice, the artificial timeline she'd created, the way she'd dismissed my desire to think things over or consult other advisors. She said if I didn't trust them enough to let them help, they'd have to make different plans for their lives. What do you think she meant by that? Eleanor sighed heavily. "I think she meant they've been counting on having access to your assets for their own financial planning. Maybe they've made commitments or investments based on anticipated inheritance. Maybe they're in debt and need your resources to bail them out. Either way, they're treating your property like it's already theirs." The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, with Eleanor helping me understand not just the legal implications of the documents, but the emotional manipulation tactics Gwyneth had been using. The artificial urgency, the appeals to my fear and vulnerability, the way she'd framed my resistance as stubbornness rather than prudence. All of it followed a pattern that Eleanor had seen in other families dealing with financial elder abuse. "The hardest part," Eleanor said as I prepared to leave, "is that you're going to have to confront her about this. You can't just ignore those papers and hope she drops the subject. She's going to keep escalating the pressure until you either give in or make it clear that you see what she's doing." The drive home felt longer than the trip to Eleanor's house, weighted down by the knowledge that I was going to have the most difficult conversation of my relationship with my daughter. How do you tell the child you raised and loved that you recognize their behavior as manipulative and potentially abusive? How do you maintain a relationship with someone who's been systematically working to gain control over your life? Back in my own kitchen, I stared at those documents again, but now they looked different. Instead of expressions of loving concern, they appeared as what they actually were: legal instruments designed to strip away my autonomy and independence. The yellow highlighting no longer looked like helpful guidance. It looked like targets painted on my freedom. That night, I called Gwyneth to ask her to come over the following day for a serious conversation. Her immediate response told me everything I needed to know about her expectations. Did you review those documents we left? Are you ready to get everything signed and notarized? Gabriel found a mobile notary who can come to your house this weekend if you'd prefer not to go. Out. The eagerness in her voice, the assumption that I'd simply comply with her demands, the fact that she'd already arranged for a notary before knowing my decision. It all confirmed Eleanor's assessment of the situation. Gwyneth, I want to talk about those papers before I make any decisions. Can you come over tomorrow afternoon? Just you, not Gabriel. I think we need to have a mother-daughter conversation about this. The pause that followed was telling. Mom, Gabriel's really involved in the financial aspects of this. It would be better if he's here to answer any questions you might have about the investment opportunities or the tax implications. Just you, Gwyneth. If I decide to move forward with any of this, there will be plenty of time for Gabriel to explain the details. But first, I want to understand why you think I need these protections right now. After we hung up, I sat in my living room looking at the framed photos that chronicled Gwyneth's life, her high school graduation, her wedding day, family gatherings over the years. In every picture, she was smiling, surrounded by people who loved her, supported by parents who had given her every advantage they could afford. I wondered when she'd started seeing me not as the mother who had raised her, but as an obstacle to her financial security. I wondered if she genuinely believed I was becoming incompetent, or if she simply found it convenient to portray me that way. Most painfully, I wondered if our relationship could survive the conversation we were about to have. But Eleanor was right. Ignoring the situation wasn't an option. Gwyneth had made it clear that she expected an answer, and continuing to avoid the issue would only give her more ammunition to use against me. Tomorrow, I was going to have to look my daughter in the eye and tell her that I knew exactly what she was trying to do. The question was whether she would back down when confronted, or whether she would escalate her efforts to gain control over my life. Either way, I was about to discover just how far my own daughter was willing to go to get what she wanted from me. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp November air that usually filled me with energy and purpose, but today it carried an undercurrent of dread. Gwyneth was scheduled to arrive at 2 o'clock for our conversation about the documents, and I'd spent the hours since dawn trying to prepare myself for what felt like stepping into a minefield. But Eleanor's words kept echoing in my mind. I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with before I could effectively confront it. Over my morning coffee, I made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable just weeks earlier. I was going to investigate my own daughter. The first step was understanding whether Gwyneth's sudden interest in my finances stemmed from genuine concern or personal need. If she and Gabriel were facing financial difficulties, it would explain the urgency and pressure tactics they'd been using. I started by doing something I'd never done before. I looked up their house on the county assessor's website. What I found was illuminating. Their home in Thornfield Estates was valued at $485,000, with an outstanding mortgage of $420,000. Property taxes alone were running them over $8,000 a year. For a couple in their 30s, it was an ambitious purchase that would require substantial dual incomes to maintain comfortably. Next, I called my friend Clara Hill, who worked as a receptionist at Pinnacle Marketing Solutions, Gwyneth's company. Clara and I had known each other through the food bank for years, and while she was naturally discreet about workplace matters, I hoped she might be able to shed some light on Gwyneth's professional situation. "Oh, Lydia, I'm so glad to hear you're recovering well," Clara said when I called. "Gwyneth mentioned you'd had surgery. She seemed very worried about you." I kept my tone casual. "Yes, she's been very attentive. Actually, she's been talking about making some career changes, maybe taking on more responsibility at work. I was wondering how things have been going for her there." Clara's hesitation was slight but noticeable. "Well, I probably shouldn't say too much about personnel matters, but there have been some changes recently. The company's been restructuring, and several management positions have been eliminated. Gwyneth's department has been hit pretty hard. My stomach dropped. Is her job secure? I honestly don't know, Lydia. There have been a lot of closed-door meetings and people are definitely nervous. I hate to be the bearer of potentially bad news, but I thought you should know, especially if she's been discussing major life decisions with you. After hanging up with Clara, I sat staring at my phone, pieces of a puzzle beginning to form a disturbing picture. If Gwyneth was facing potential job loss while carrying a massive mortgage, her sudden interest in my assets would make perfect sense, but it would also make her recent behavior far more calculated and desperate than I'd imagined. My next call was to Walter Rogers, an old friend who'd worked in estate planning before his retirement. I'd helped his wife through her cancer treatment years ago, and he'd always told me to call if I ever needed legal advice. Walter, I need to ask you about something confidential, I said after we'd exchanged pleasantries. If someone were to get me to sign documents giving them power of attorney and transferring my house to them, what would that actually mean for my future security? Walter's voice immediately became more serious. Lydia, are you being pressured to sign something? Because if you are, you need to be very careful. Those kinds of documents can be nearly impossible to reverse once they're in place. He explained that the combination of documents Gwyneth had presented would essentially make me financially powerless in my own life. The healthcare proxy would allow them to make decisions about my living situation, potentially forcing me into assisted living if they deemed it necessary. The financial power of attorney would give them access to all my accounts and the ability to make investments or purchases without my consent. The quitclaim deed would mean I could lose my home entirely if they decided I was no longer capable of living independently. The most troubling part, Walter continued, is that once someone has that level of control, they can make it very difficult for you to regain your independence, even if you're perfectly competent. They could liquidate your assets, sell your home, and move you into care facilities, all while claiming they're acting in your best interest. Walter's explanation confirmed my worst fears about the documents, but it also gave me an idea. Walter, if someone were planning to use those documents against me, would they leave any kind of paper trail? Email communications, financial records, that sort of thing? Absolutely. These kinds of schemes usually involve significant planning and coordination. If you suspect someone's trying to manipulate you financially, there are usually electronic records that would prove intent. After ending the call with Walter, I realized I needed to gather evidence of Gwyneth's real intentions before confronting her directly. The problem was that most of her communications would be on devices I couldn't access. But then I remembered something that might give me the proof I needed. During one of Gwyneth's recent visits, she'd used my computer to help me organize my digital files. She'd spent nearly an hour at my laptop, supposedly helping me clean up my email and organize my documents, but now I wondered if she'd been doing something else entirely. I opened my laptop and checked the browser history. What I found made my blood run cold. During her visit, Gwyneth had researched probate attorneys, estate liquidation services, and senior living facilities in the area. She'd looked up the average time for probate proceedings, the tax implications of inherited property, and the process for selling inherited assets. But the most damning discovery was in my emails sent folder. Gwyneth had used my email account to send herself copies of my bank statements, insurance policies, and the deed to my house. She'd also forwarded herself my contact information for Dr. Harrison and my insurance company. The evidence was overwhelming. While pretending to help me organize my files, my daughter had systematically stolen my financial information and researched how to liquidate my assets after my death. She hadn't just been planning for my eventual passing, she'd been actively preparing to profit from it. My hands were shaking as I screenshot everything I'd found, saving the evidence to a folder on my desktop. Then I did something that felt like a betrayal of everything I'd believed about trust and family relationships. I changed all my passwords and enabled two-factor authentication on every account I could access. The final piece of my investigation involved a call to Miller's Market to speak with Janet Miller directly. Janet had known me for 15 years, and when I explained that I'd heard about Gwyneth's conversation with her about funeral arrangements, her response confirmed Eleanor's account. "Oh, Lydia, I was so confused by that conversation," Janet said. Gwyneth was asking very specific questions about pricing and timelines, and she seemed to already know exactly what kind of service she wanted. When I asked about the deceased, she said it was for future planning, but the way she talked about it made it sound like the arrangements were needed soon. "I almost called you to make sure you were okay." By 1 o'clock, I had assembled a comprehensive picture of my daughter's activities and intentions. The evidence showed a pattern of deception, theft, and manipulation that went far beyond confused concern for an aging parent. Gwyneth had been systematically preparing to gain control of my assets, researching how to liquidate them, and even planning my funeral arrangements, all while I was recovering from successful routine surgery. As I waited for her arrival, I felt a strange combination of heartbreak and determination. The daughter I'd raised and loved had been working against me in the most fundamental way possible, treating my life and independence as obstacles to her financial security. But now I had proof of what she'd been doing, and I was prepared to confront her with evidence she couldn't deny or explain away. At exactly 2 o'clock, I heard Gwyneth's car in my driveway. Through the window, I watched her gather a folder of what looked like additional documents from her passenger seat. She was still expecting to leave my house with signed papers that would give her control over my life. Instead, she was about to discover that her own actions had given me all the evidence I needed to understand exactly who she'd become, and what I needed to do to protect myself from my own child. When Gwyneth knocked on my front door at precisely 2 o'clock, I was ready for her in ways she couldn't have anticipated. The evidence I'd gathered over the past week was printed and organized in a manila folder, hidden in my bedroom dresser where she wouldn't accidentally discover it. But more importantly, I'd spent the morning setting up what Walter Rogers had suggested when I'd called him back for additional advice. A controlled environment where Gwyneth would reveal her true intentions while I documented everything. I positioned a small digital recorder, borrowed from Eleanor, in the kitchen drawer closest to where we'd be sitting. My laptop was open on the counter, ostensibly for looking up information, but actually recording our conversation through software Walter had helped me install during a quick tutorial session. I'd even asked my neighbor, George Holmes, to be available by phone in case I needed a witness to anything that transpired. "Mom, you look so much better," Gwyneth said as she entered, carrying not just the folder I'd expected, but also a small briefcase that suggested she'd come prepared for a comprehensive business transaction. I brought some additional paperwork that Gabriel thought might be helpful, and I've got the mobile notary on standby. "We could have everything finalized today if you're ready. Today if you're ready." The presumption in her voice was staggering. She'd arrived at my home with a briefcase full of legal documents and a notary waiting in the wings, without any confirmation that I was prepared to sign anything. It was exactly the kind of pressure tactic that Walter had warned me about, creating artificial urgency and momentum to prevent careful consideration of life-altering decisions. "Let's sit down and talk first," I said, leading her to the kitchen table where the original documents still lay. "I've had time to review everything you left, and I have some questions." Gwyneth's smile was bright and confident as she settled into her chair. "Of course. I'm sure some of the legal language is confusing. That's why Gabriel prepared these supplementary explanations." She opened her briefcase and began laying out additional papers, simplified summaries of each document, timeline charts showing the benefits of immediate action, and what appeared to be financial projections showing how much money I could save by transferring my assets now rather than later. The level of preparation was breathtaking. This wasn't a spontaneous family discussion about my future security. This was a full-scale sales presentation designed to convince me to surrender my independence. "Gwyneth," I began carefully, "help me understand something. When did you first start thinking about these arrangements? Was it after my surgery, Or had you been considering this earlier? Her answer came a little too quickly. Oh, definitely. After your surgery, Mom. Seeing you in that hospital bed, realizing how quickly things could change, it really opened our eyes to how unprepared we all were. Gabriel and I spent hours talking about how we could better protect you and support you going forward. I nodded thoughtfully, then reached for my laptop. I appreciate that. Actually, would you mind helping me understand some of the financial projections Gabriel prepared? I'd like to look up some of the investment opportunities he mentioned, just so I can better understand the potential benefits. As I opened various browser windows and pretended to research investment options, I was actually accessing the evidence I'd gathered about Gwyneth's own financial research. But more importantly, I was giving her opportunities to elaborate on her plans while the recording software captured everything. What kind of timeline are you and Gabriel thinking about for these investments? I asked. I mean, if I were to transfer my assets to your management, how quickly would you want to make changes? Gwyneth's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. Well, Gabriel's identified some really promising opportunities that require moving fast. There's a commercial real estate deal that needs funding by the end of next week, and some stock options that won't be available much longer. Honestly, the sooner we can get everything transferred, the better positioned we'll be to maximize your returns. The mention of specific timelines and investment opportunities was exactly what Walter had told me to listen for. Evidence that they had concrete plans for my money that went beyond general asset protection. And what about the house? I continued. If I transfer ownership to you and Gabriel, what changes would you want to make? Here, Gwyneth became even more animated. We've actually been thinking about that a lot. The house has so much potential, but it needs updates to really maximize its value. We'd probably want to renovate the kitchen, update the bathrooms, maybe add a deck. Of course, we'd consult with you about any changes while you're still living here. The phrase, while you're still living here, sent a chill through me, but I maintained my composed expression. How long do you think I'd be able to stay in the house? I mean, realistically, given my age and health? Gwyneth's response revealed more than she probably intended. Well, Gabriel's been researching some really nice assisted living facilities in the area. Nothing immediate, of course, but we want to be prepared. Some of them have waiting lists, so it's smart to get your name on them early. There's one called Sunset Manor that's supposed to be really lovely. Private rooms, activities, medical staff on site. We toured it last weekend, actually, just to get a sense of what's available. My heart nearly stopped. They had toured assisted living facilities without my knowledge, while I was home recovering from surgery and perfectly capable of independent living. They weren't just planning for my eventual decline. They were actively preparing to relocate me. That was thoughtful of you to research options, I managed to say. How soon would you recommend making that transition? Well, Dr. Harrison mentioned that recovery from surgery can sometimes reveal other health issues in older patients, Gwyneth said. And honestly, Mom, we've noticed you seeming a little more forgetful lately, a little less steady on your feet. It might be smart to make the transition while you're still healthy enough to adjust well, rather than waiting for a crisis. This was pure fabrication. Dr. Harrison had never mentioned any concerns about my cognitive function or stability, and I hadn't shown any signs of forgetfulness or physical decline. Gwyneth was creating fictional health issues to justify her timeline for gaining control of my assets and living situation. I hadn't noticed any problems with my memory or balance, I said carefully. Can you give me some specific examples of what you've observed? Gwyneth's pause was telling. Well, you forgot to call me back last Tuesday after I left a message. And when we were here last week, you seemed confused about which bills you'd already paid. Little things, but they add up. I had called her back the same day she'd left the message, and I'd never expressed any confusion about my bills. She was manufacturing evidence of cognitive decline to support her argument for immediate intervention. The conversation continued for another hour, with Gwyneth becoming increasingly specific about their plans for my assets, my living situation, and my future care. With each detail she revealed, I understood more clearly that this wasn't about protecting me. It was about positioning themselves to benefit from my diminished independence. By the time she began pushing for my signature on the documents, I had recorded more than enough evidence to demonstrate her true intentions. But I needed one final piece of proof, something that would show the full scope of her planning. Gwyneth, before I make any decisions, I want to make sure I understand all the implications. If something were to happen to me, if I became seriously ill or worse, how would you and Gabriel handle things? Have you thought through those scenarios? Her response was swift and detailed, revealing planning that went far beyond normal family preparedness. She described their research into probate procedures, their consultations with estate liquidation services, and their plans for selling both my house and their current home to purchase something larger in a better neighborhood. We've actually been pre-approved for a mortgage on a house in Millbrook Heights, she said. It's a much better area, great schools for when we start our family, but we'd need the proceeds from both properties to make it work financially. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Gwyneth and Gabriel weren't just planning to manage my assets for my benefit, they were planning to liquidate them, to fund their own lifestyle upgrades. My death or incapacitation wasn't a tragedy they were preparing to handle. It was a financial opportunity they were actively anticipating. As Gwyneth packed up her briefcase, clearly frustrated by my reluctance to sign immediately, I realized I now had everything I needed to protect myself. The recordings would prove her deceptive intentions. The evidence from my computer would show her unauthorized access to my financial information, and her own words had revealed the full scope of her manipulative planning. I need a little more time to think about this, I told her, which prompted another round of pressure tactics about missed opportunities and artificial deadlines, but I remained firm, and eventually she left with a promise to give me a few more days to make the right decision. After she drove away, I sat in my kitchen listening to the recordings I'd made, hearing my daughter's voice planning my future, with cold calculation rather than loving concern. The evidence was overwhelming and heartbreaking, but it was also empowering. Now I knew exactly what I was dealing with, and I could plan my response accordingly. The truth about Gwyneth's intentions was finally clear, documented, and undeniable. Now it was time to decide what to do with that truth. The moment of absolute clarity came not during my recorded conversation with Gwyneth, but 3 days later when I discovered something that shattered any remaining doubt about my daughter's true intentions. It was a Tuesday morning, and I was doing something I'd never done before in 34 years of motherhood. I was following my own child. The decision to tail Gwyneth hadn't been made lightly. After our Saturday conversation, she'd called twice, daily with increasing urgency about the time-sensitive opportunities that required immediate action on my financial documents. Her pressure tactics had escalated to include veiled threats about my ability to remain in my home and subtle suggestions that my mental capacity was declining more rapidly than I realized. But it was her slip during Monday evening's phone call that triggered my decision to investigate further. While discussing the assisted living facility they'd toured, she mentioned that the director had told them about an opening coming up in early December and that they'd put down a small deposit to hold the spot. A deposit. They had paid money to reserve a room for me at an assisted living facility without my knowledge or consent, while I was perfectly healthy and living independently in my own home. The audacity of it was breathtaking, but it also revealed a level of concrete planning that went far beyond the theoretical discussions we'd been having. That night, I called Walter Rogers and played him portions of my recorded conversation with Gwyneth. His reaction was immediate and alarmed. "Lydia, what you're describing isn't family planning. It's elder abuse in the planning stages. The fact that they've made financial commitments based on assumed control of your assets suggests they're operating under the assumption that your consent is a formality rather than a requirement." Walter's words crystallized something I'd been reluctant to acknowledge. My daughter wasn't just hoping for my cooperation with her plans. She was expecting it, and she'd already begun implementing those plans whether I agreed or not. The next morning, I positioned myself in my car across from Gwyneth's workplace, feeling like a character in one of the mystery novels I loved to read. At 11:30, just as Clara Hill had suggested when I'd called her for an update, Gwyneth emerged from the Pinnacle Marketing Solutions building carrying a box of personal belongings. My heart sank as I watched my daughter load her work possessions into her car with the mechanical movements of someone who'd been expecting this moment. Clara had been right about the company restructuring. Gwyneth had lost her job. But rather than telling me about this significant change in her circumstances, she'd been calling daily to pressure me into signing over my assets. I followed her car through downtown Clearwater, expecting her to head home to Thornfield Estates. Instead, she drove to the offices of Meridian Financial Services, a wealth management firm I recognized from their advertisements in the local newspaper. She was inside for nearly an hour, and when she emerged, she was accompanied by a man in an expensive suit who walked her to her car with the kind of attentiveness that suggested she was a valued client. From Meridian Financial, Gwyneth drove to First National Bank, my bank, where I'd maintained accounts for over 20 years. She was inside for another 45 minutes, long enough for me to become deeply uncomfortable about what business she might be conducting at my financial institution. But it was her final stop that provided the smoking gun I needed. Gwyneth drove to the offices of Blackwood, Chen & Associates, the law firm that Walter Rogers had warned me specialized in what he diplomatically called aggressive estate planning. I watched her enter the building carrying a manila folder that looked suspiciously like the one containing my financial documents. I sat in my car outside that law firm for 2 hours, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I processed the implications of what I was witnessing. While pressuring me to sign documents for my own protection, Gwyneth had been conducting her own parallel legal and financial consultations. She hadn't been waiting for my consent. She'd been preparing to move forward, with or without it. When Gwyneth finally emerged from the law office, she was no longer alone. She was accompanied by a woman in a sharp business suit who handed her several documents before they shook hands with the kind of firm professionalism that suggested concluded business rather than preliminary consultation. I followed Gwyneth's car back toward her neighborhood, but instead of going home, she stopped at an upscale restaurant called the Brass Lantern. Through the window, I watched her meet Gabriel at a corner table, spreading papers between them as they talked with animated enthusiasm. Their body language was celebratory, not concerned. They ordered wine with lunch and spent nearly 2 hours in what appeared to be detailed planning discussions. That evening, Gwyneth called me with her usual check-in, but this time I was prepared. "How was your day, sweetheart?" I asked casually. "Oh, just the usual. Work was busy, ran some errands, nothing exciting." The lie rolled off her tongue with practiced ease. "Are you still enjoying your job at Pinnacle Marketing? You've been there? So long now." Another pause. "Yes, everything's going well there. Actually, they've been talking about some new opportunities for advancement." She was lying directly to my face about losing her job while simultaneously pressuring me to sign over my financial security. The disconnect between her words and her actions was so complete that I finally understood I wasn't dealing with a confused or worried daughter. I was dealing with someone who had made calculated decisions to deceive me for personal gain. "Gwyneth," I said carefully, "I've been thinking more about those documents you brought over. Before I make any decisions, I'd like to meet with my own lawyer, just to make sure I understand all the implications." The change in her voice was immediate. "Mom, we've been through this. Bringing in outside lawyers just complicates everything and costs money you don't need to spend. Gabriel and I have already done all the research. We're trying to help you, but we can't protect you if you won't. Trust us." The manipulation was so blatant now that I wondered how I'd ever missed it. "I think it's reasonable for me to want independent legal advice before signing over my house and financial control." Mom. Gwyneth's voice took on an edge I'd never heard before. Gabriel and I have been making plans based on getting this paperwork finalized. We've made commitments, signed contracts. If you keep delaying this, you're going to cost us opportunities we can't get back. There it was, the truth finally spoken aloud. They had made financial commitments based on anticipated access to my assets. They weren't asking for my cooperation. They were demanding it to cover obligations they'd already undertaken. What kind of commitments? I asked. The pause was long enough that I could practically hear her calculating how much to reveal. Just investments, deposits on things. Look, the important thing is that everything we're doing is for your benefit and ours. We're family. We should be working together, not against each other. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen surrounded by the evidence I'd gathered over the past week. The recordings of Gwyneth's contradictory statements, the screenshots of her unauthorized access to my financial information, the documentation of her research into probate procedures and estate liquidation, the witness accounts of her funeral, planning conversations, and now, visual confirmation of her meetings with lawyers and financial advisors while lying to me about her employment status. The pattern was clear and undeniable. My daughter had lost her job and needed access to my assets to cover financial commitments she and Gabriel had made. Rather than asking for help or admitting their difficulties, they had constructed an elaborate deception designed to convince me I was incapable of managing my own affairs. They had researched my death, planned my relocation to assisted living, and prepared legal strategies to gain control of my property and savings. The most painful part wasn't the deception itself. It was the realization that Gwyneth had never intended to ask for my help as an equal. She had decided that manipulating me was easier than respecting me, that my independence was less important than her financial security, and that her needs justified any level of dishonesty. I had raised a daughter who was willing to sacrifice her mother's autonomy to solve her own problems. And now I had to decide what to do with that devastating knowledge. The truth was finally, completely, heartbreakingly clear. The question now was how to use that truth to protect myself, and perhaps to show Gwyneth the consequences of treating family relationships as financial transactions. The confrontation I'd been dreading and planning for came sooner than expected. On Thursday morning, just 2 days after I'd followed Gwyneth through her secret meetings with lawyers and financial advisors, she arrived at my house unannounced with Gabriel and a man I didn't recognize carrying an official-looking briefcase. "Mom, we brought someone to help us finalize everything today," Gwyneth announced as she entered my house without waiting for an invitation. "This is Mr. Felix Cole from Blackwood, Chen & Associates. He's an estate planning specialist who can make sure all the paperwork is handled correctly." The audacity of bringing a lawyer to my home without my consent, expecting me to sign life-altering documents on the spot, was so breathtaking that for a moment I could only stare at them. Felix Cole was the same man I'd seen shaking hands with Gwyneth outside the law office 2 days earlier. This wasn't a spontaneous decision to bring legal help. This was a planned ambush designed to pressure me into compliance. "Gwyneth, I told you I wanted to consult with my own lawyer before making any decisions," I said, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. Felix Cole stepped forward with the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to handling family disputes. "Mrs. Parker, I understand your concerns, but I can assure you that these documents have been carefully crafted to protect your interests while providing your family with the tools they need to care for you properly. Everything is completely standard and in your best interest." Gabriel opened his briefcase and began arranging papers on my kitchen table with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before. "Mrs. Parker, we've brought everything we need to get this finalized today. The notary is waiting outside, and we've scheduled time with the bank this afternoon to handle the financial transfers. They had brought a notary. They had scheduled bank appointments. They had planned my entire day around signing over my independence, without asking my permission or even confirming my willingness to participate. I'm not signing anything today. I said firmly. In fact, I'm not signing anything until I understand exactly what's been going on behind my back. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Gwyneth's composed expression faltered slightly, and Gabriel looked genuinely confused by my resistance. "Mom, what are you talking about?" Gwyneth asked, her voice taking on the patient tone people use with children or confused elderly relatives. "We've been completely transparent about everything. We're trying to help you." I walked to my bedroom and retrieved the manila folder, containing all the evidence I'd gathered over the past week. When I returned to the kitchen, I set it on the table next to their legal documents. "Let's talk about transparency," I said, opening the folder to reveal printed screenshots of Gwyneth's unauthorized access to my financial accounts through my computer. "Can you explain why you used my laptop to send yourself copies of my bank statements, insurance policies, and property deed?" Gwyneth's face went pale, but she recovered quickly. "Mom, you asked me to help you organize your digital files. I was just making sure your important documents were backed up safely." "And can you explain this?" I pulled out printed pages showing her browser history from that day, the searches for probate attorneys, estate liquidation services, and senior living facilities. "You were researching how to sell my assets and planning my funeral while pretending to help me organize my email." Felix Cole cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "Mrs. Parker, I think there may be some misunderstandings here. Your daughter's research shows appropriate family planning and preparation." "Then perhaps you can explain this," I said, turning to Gabriel. "I know Gwyneth lost her job on Tuesday. I know you've been to my bank conducting business related to my accounts. And I know you've put a deposit down at Sunset Manor to reserve a room for me without my knowledge or consent." The silence that followed was deafening. Gabriel's face had gone ashen, and Gwyneth was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Cold calculation mixed with something that looked like panic. "How could you possibly know any of that?" Gwyneth asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because I followed you, Gwyneth. I watched you clean out your office. I saw you meet with financial advisors and lawyers. I observed you celebrating over lunch at the Brass Lantern while lying to me about your employment status and pressuring me to sign over my assets." Felix Cole was gathering his papers, clearly recognizing that his services were no longer needed or wanted. "Perhaps this would be a good time for me to excuse myself and let the family work through these complications." "No, Mr. Cole. Please stay," I said firmly. "I want a witness to what happens next." I pulled out my phone and played a portion of the recording from my conversation with Gwyneth the previous Saturday. Her voice filled the kitchen, detailing their plans for my house, their research into assisted living facilities, their timeline for liquidating my assets to purchase a home in Millbrook Heights. The recording captured her discussing my fictional cognitive decline and her manufactured urgency about investment opportunities that required immediate access to my money. As her own words played back to her, Gwyneth's mask finally slipped completely. The concerned daughter facade evaporated, replaced by someone I barely recognized. "Fine," she said, her voice sharp with frustration. "Yes, we need access to your assets. Yes, we've made plans based on getting control of your finances. Do you have any idea what our mortgage payments are? What it costs to maintain the lifestyle you encouraged me to build?" Gabriel tried to intervene. "Gwyneth, maybe we should—" "No." "Gabriel!" she snapped. "I'm tired of pretending. Mom, you're going to die eventually anyway. You have no other children, no grandchildren to inherit your money. Everything you have is going to come to us whether you cooperate now or not. We're just trying to make the transition easier for everyone involved." The brutal honesty was more shocking than all her previous deceptions combined. My daughter had just admitted that she viewed my death as an inevitable transfer of assets, and her only concern was accessing those assets as quickly as possible. "And if I refuse to cooperate?" I asked quietly. Gwyneth's laugh was bitter. "Mom, you're almost 60 years old, living alone, with no other family. Gabriel and I are your healthcare proxies by default. If we decide you're no longer capable of living independently, who's going to argue with us? Dr. Harrison trusts our judgment about your well-being. The threat was clear and chilling. If I didn't voluntarily surrender my independence, they were prepared to have me declared incompetent and forcibly relocated to assisted living. Felix Cole stood abruptly, his professional composure finally cracking. I cannot and will not be party to elder abuse or coercion. Mrs. Parker, I strongly recommend you contact Adult Protective Services and retain independent legal counsel immediately. After he left, the three of us sat in a silence that felt like the aftermath of an explosion. Everything that had been hidden was now exposed. Every pretense had been stripped away. The daughter I'd raised and loved had just threatened to have me declared incompetent if I didn't voluntarily surrender my home and savings to solve her financial problems. Gwyneth, I said finally, my voice eerily calm, I want you and Gabriel to leave my house immediately. I want you to cancel any appointments you've made regarding my finances, and I want you to get your deposit back from Sunset Manor. And if we don't? Gabriel asked, his voice barely audible. I pulled out the business card Walter Rogers had given me the day before. Then you'll be hearing from my attorney, and possibly from the district attorney's office. What you've been doing is called elder abuse, and it's a felony in this state. Gwyneth stood slowly, her face a mask of cold anger. You're making a mistake, Mom. Gabriel and I are the only family you have. When you're old and sick and alone, remember that you chose this. I'll remember that I chose to protect myself from people who were willing to steal my independence for their own financial gain, I replied, even when those people were my own daughter. After they left, I sat in my kitchen surrounded by the evidence of their betrayal, feeling simultaneously heartbroken and liberated. The daughter I'd raised was gone, replaced by someone willing to sacrifice her mother's autonomy for her own convenience. But I was still here, still competent, still capable of protecting myself. The confrontation had been devastating, but it had also been necessary. Now I knew exactly where I stood, and I could plan accordingly. My daughter had shown me who she really was, and I finally believed her. The weeks following my confrontation with Gwyneth passed in a strange mixture of grief and relief. For the first time in months, my phone wasn't ringing twice daily with pressure-filled check-ins disguised as concern. My mailbox wasn't filling up with legal documents requiring my immediate attention. My home felt like my sanctuary again rather than a target for acquisition. But the silence also carried the weight of profound loss. I wasn't just missing my daughter's presence. I was mourning the daughter I'd thought I had, the relationship I'd believed we shared, and the future I'd imagined we'd build together. It felt like grieving someone who was still alive but had become a stranger. Eleanor Chen became my lifeline during those difficult weeks. She brought groceries without being asked, sat with me through long afternoons of processing what had happened, and helped me navigate the practical steps of protecting myself legally and financially. It was Eleanor who insisted I follow through on Walter Rogers' advice about contacting Adult Protective Services, not to press charges against Gwyneth, but to create an official record of what had occurred. You need documentation, Eleanor explained as we sat in my kitchen reviewing the paperwork I'd filled out for APS. Not because you plan to pursue legal action, but because they might try this again. People who are willing to go this far don't usually just give up because they got caught once. Eleanor's words proved prophetic. 2 weeks after our confrontation, I received a certified letter from Blackwood, Chen and Associates. Not from Felix Cole, who had apparently distanced himself from Gwyneth's case after witnessing our kitchen showdown, but from another attorney, in the firm named Frederick Scott. The letter was carefully worded but unmistakably threatening. It claimed that Gabriel and Gwyneth had serious concerns about my mental capacity and ability to live independently. It referenced my recent erratic behavior and poor judgment regarding financial decisions as evidence that I might need assistance managing my affairs. It suggested that if I continued to refuse their help, they would have no choice but to petition the court for a competency evaluation. Reading that letter felt like being slapped. My own daughter was threatening to have me declared legally incompetent because I'd refused to voluntarily surrender my independence to her. The manipulative tactics hadn't ended with our confrontation. They had escalated. But I was no longer the confused, trusting mother who had initially believed Gwyneth's expressions of concern. I was prepared. Walter Rogers reviewed the letter and immediately recognized it as what he called intimidation disguised as legal advice. He helped me craft a response that was both professional and devastating. Our reply included copies of the recordings I'd made, documentation of Gwyneth's unauthorized access to my financial accounts, evidence of her job loss that she'd concealed while pressuring me for money, and statements from Dr. Harrison confirming my excellent cognitive and physical health. Most importantly, Walter had arranged for me to undergo comprehensive cognitive testing with a geriatric neuropsychologist. The results, which we included with our response, showed that my mental acuity was not only normal for my age, but actually above average in several key areas. Any court-ordered competency evaluation would only confirm what we'd already documented. The response letter we sent to Frederick Scott was a masterpiece of legal precision. Walter had essentially proven that any attempt to challenge my competency would not only fail, but would expose Gwyneth and Gabriel to serious legal consequences for elder abuse and attempted financial exploitation. We never heard from Blackwood, Chen and Associates again. During this same period, I was rebuilding my life with an energy and purpose I hadn't felt in years. The stress of constant manipulation had been replaced by the clarity that comes from understanding your situation completely. I changed all my passwords, added additional security measures to my financial accounts, and updated my will to ensure that my assets would go to the charities I cared about rather than to people who viewed my death as a financial opportunity. More importantly, I was rediscovering the joy in my daily routines. My morning coffee tasted better without the dread of manipulative phone calls. My garden flourished under renewed attention. My volunteer work at the food bank became more fulfilling as I realized how much I valued genuine human connection built on mutual respect rather than hidden agendas. Clara Hill, my friend from Gwyneth's former workplace, provided an unexpected postscript to the whole saga. She called me in early December with news that felt like cosmic justice. "Lydia, I thought you should know. Gabriel Adams was arrested yesterday for mortgage fraud. Apparently, he'd been falsifying income information and forging documents to secure loans for properties he couldn't actually afford. The FBI has been investigating him for months." The news hit me like a physical blow, but not because I felt sorry for Gabriel. I was devastated to realize how close I'd come to being financially entangled with someone who was apparently a criminal. If I'd signed those documents Gwyneth had brought, if I'd transferred my house and given them power of attorney over my finances, I could have lost everything when Gabriel's illegal activities came to light. Clara continued, "The word around town is that Gwyneth knew about the financial problems but not about the fraud. She's filed for divorce and moved back in with her parents. My daughter's carefully constructed life had collapsed completely. The expensive house in Thornfield Estates was being seized by federal agents. The husband she'd counted on for financial security was facing years in prison. The lifestyle she'd been so desperate to maintain had been built on criminal activity. Part of me felt vindicated by this turn of events. Gwyneth's urgency to access my assets hadn't been about protecting me. It had been about saving herself from the consequences of Gabriel's choices. But a larger part of me felt profoundly sad for the daughter who had been so afraid of losing her material security that she'd been willing to sacrifice her relationship with her mother to maintain it. In January, 3 months after our kitchen confrontation, Gwyneth called me for the first time since that devastating day. Her voice was small, defeated, barely recognizable as the confident manipulator who had tried to pressure me into signing away my independence. "Mom," she said quietly. "I think I need help." The conversation that followed was unlike any we'd ever had. Gwyneth told me about Gabriel's arrest, about discovering the extent of his financial deception, about losing the house and the lifestyle she'd thought was permanent. She talked about being alone for the first time in years, staying in her childhood bedroom at her parents' house, and realizing how much of her identity had been tied to material possessions and social status. "I don't know who I am without the house and the car and all the things I thought made me successful," she admitted. "And I don't know how to face what I almost did to you." For the first time in our relationship, my daughter was speaking to me, with complete honesty about her fears, her mistakes, and her need for genuine support rather than financial rescue. It was the conversation I'd been hoping for my entire life, and it had taken the collapse of her entire world to make it possible. "Gwyneth," I said softly, "I've never stopped loving you. I stopped trusting you, but I never stopped loving you. The question is whether you're ready to rebuild a relationship based on honesty instead of manipulation. The journey back to genuine connection wouldn't be easy or quick. Trust, once broken so thoroughly, takes time and consistent action to repair. But for the first time since before my surgery, I felt hope that my daughter and I might eventually find our way back to each other, not as manipulator and victim, but as two women who had learned hard lessons about the difference between love and control. 2 years have passed since that October morning when I went into surgery expecting routine gallbladder removal and emerged to discover my daughter planning my funeral. As I sit in my garden on this warm spring afternoon, tending to the same rose bushes Walter planted decades ago, I find myself reflecting on how completely my understanding of family, trust, and resilience has been transformed by that experience. The roses are blooming magnificently this year, their petals unfurling in shades of deep red and soft pink that seem to glow in the afternoon sunlight. Walter always said that roses taught the best lessons about life. They require strong roots, careful tending, and the wisdom to know when pruning is necessary for healthy growth. I understand now what he meant in ways I never could have imagined while he was alive. My relationship with Gwyneth has slowly, carefully begun to heal, but it looks nothing like what we had before. After Gabriel's arrest and the collapse of her carefully constructed life, Gwyneth spent 8 months living with her parents and working as a receptionist at a dental office, a humbling come-down from her previous management position, but honest work that gave her time to reflect on the choices that had led to her downfall. Our first real conversation after her initial cry for help took place not in my kitchen, where so much deception had unfolded, but on neutral ground at Brewster's Cafe. Gwyneth looked smaller somehow, wearing clothes from discount stores rather than the designer outfits she'd favored during her Thornfield Estates years. But there was something in her eyes that I hadn't seen since she was a child, genuine vulnerability instead of calculated emotion. "I need you to know that I understand what I did," she said, her hands wrapped around a simple ceramic coffee mug instead of the elaborate specialty drinks she used to order. "I convinced myself I was protecting you, but I was really trying to solve my own problems with your money. I turned you into a financial resource instead of treating you like my mother." The conversation lasted 3 hours, with Gwyneth taking full responsibility for her deception, without making excuses about Gabriel's influence or their financial pressures. She acknowledged that she had researched my death while I was recovering from surgery, that she had stolen my financial information, and that she had been prepared to have me declared incompetent if I refused to cooperate with her plans. "The worst part," she said, tears finally coming after years of calculated composure, "is that I almost destroyed the only person who ever loved me unconditionally. I treated your love like it was something I could exploit instead of something I should cherish." That conversation became the foundation for a new relationship built on honesty rather than assumption. We meet for coffee once a month now, always in public places, always with clear boundaries about what topics are welcome and which ones are still too raw to discuss. Gwyneth tells me about her work, her therapy sessions, and her slow progress toward financial independence without help from anyone else. I share updates about my volunteer work, my reading, and the small joys that fill my days. She has never asked me for money, not once in 2 years. When her car needed major repairs, last winter she took out a loan rather than calling me for help. When she moved into her own small apartment, she furnished it with secondhand finds and garage sale treasures, rather than expecting me to contribute to her household expenses. The daughter who once demanded downtown condos and luxury SUVs now takes genuine pride in paying her own rent and managing her own budget. More importantly, she has learned to express love through presence rather than presence. Last month, when I had a minor procedure to remove a skin cancer spot from my arm, Gwyneth drove me to the appointment and sat in the waiting room without being asked. She didn't bring gifts or make grand gestures. She simply showed up and stayed, offering the kind of quiet support that means infinitely more than expensive flowers or elaborate meals. The experience has also deepened my appreciation for the friends who stood by me during the crisis. Eleanor Chen remains my closest confidant, the person I call when I need perspective or simply want to share news about my garden's progress. Walter Rogers has become more than my lawyer. He's become a trusted advisor who helps me navigate not just legal matters, but the ongoing process of protecting my independence while remaining open to genuine relationships. Clara Hill stops by monthly with updates from around town, and our friendship has grown beyond its original foundation of shared volunteer work. George Holmes, my neighbor, checks on me regularly but respectfully, offering help with heavy lifting or household projects without making me feel like a burden or a charity case. These relationships have taught me the difference between people who care about your well-being and people who care about your assets. True friends and family want to support your independence, not control it. They offer help that makes you stronger, not assistance that makes you dependent. They respect your decisions even when they disagree with them, and they never use your love for them as leverage to get what they want. I've also discovered strengths in myself that I didn't know existed before this crisis. The woman who followed her daughter through town gathering evidence, who set up recording equipment to document manipulation, who stood firm against legal threats and emotional blackmail. That woman was always inside me, waiting for circumstances that required her emergence. I am more confident now in my ability to protect myself, more aware of manipulation tactics, and more willing to trust my instincts when something feels wrong. My daily life has returned to the peaceful rhythms I cherished before Gwyneth's deception began, but with added layers of appreciation and awareness. My morning coffee tastes sweeter because I drink it without dread. My garden provides deeper satisfaction because I tend it knowing it will remain mine as long as I choose. My volunteer work at the food bank feels more meaningful because I understand how precious it is to help others without expecting anything in return. I've also made practical changes that reflect the wisdom gained from my experience. My will now includes specific provisions to prevent anyone from challenging my mental capacity or attempting to gain premature access to my assets. I've established relationships with multiple healthcare providers who can attest to my cognitive and physical well-being. I've created systems for monitoring my financial accounts that would alert me immediately to any unauthorized access attempts. Most importantly, I've learned that protecting yourself from manipulation doesn't mean closing your heart to love. It means being wise enough to recognize the difference between people who love you and people who love what you can do for them. It means understanding that setting boundaries isn't cruel. It's necessary for maintaining healthy relationships built on mutual respect rather than one-sided exploitation. The roses in my garden will bloom again next spring, and the spring after that, tended by hands that are older but wiser than they were 2 years ago. I will tend them for as many seasons as I'm able, knowing that the strength to protect what I love comes not from suspicion or isolation, but from the clear-eyed understanding that real love never requires you to surrender your dignity or independence to prove your devotion. Some stories end with dramatic reconciliation or complete estrangement. Mine ends with something more complex and perhaps more realistic. A cautious hope that relationships damaged by deception can slowly heal when both parties are willing to do the hard work of rebuilding trust, one honest conversation at a time. And, in my garden, surrounded by Walter's roses and the vegetables I grow with my own hands, I have found a peace that no one can take away from me. Because it comes not from what I own, but from who I've chosen to become in the face of betrayal and loss. That, perhaps, is the greatest gift this painful experience has given me. The knowledge that my worth has never been measured by my assets, and my security has always come from my own strength rather than from other people's promises to protect me. The roses bloom, the seasons change, and I remain, older, wiser, and unafraid. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.